You think a job is just a paycheck. You think a sewing machine is harmless. You think a yellow building on a back road won't change you. You are wrong. It was early summer when I drove out to Bees in the Basket. The back roads of Ohio were a pleasant blur then, cornfield humming, late afternoon light spilling gold over the horizon, cicadas stitching a constant, comforting racket into the air. I'd been out of work for a couple weeks after the retail place folded. The warehouse that used to be my second home had emptied overnight and left me with nothing but the echo of pallets. A friend tipped me off about the mill. They'd take anyone who could run a sewing machine. Simple work. Honest money. The kind of thing my grandma would have approved of. The mill sat off the road like a relic someone had repainted without changing anything else. Bright yellow siding, tasteful brown shutters, a proud B&B logo of a bee mid-flight. Cute, almost quaint until you glanced past it and saw the town behind the building. A water tower, a boarded-up schoolhouse, an old bar whose windows had been nailed shut so long the wood had gone gray. Time had shelled that place and left the bones. Inside, the lobby smelled like a warehouse, oil, cotton dust, and the faint, homey tang of tea someone had let go cold. A couple of old couples sat waiting, a janitor fussed with a bulky elevator, and behind a reception desk a thin woman looked up from her keyboard with a smile that made me feel both welcome and small. "You called?" she asked. "Maurice. We don't often get anyone your age." She handed me a clipboard with a form. Half the questions were normal. Lift 25 pounds, long hours, but 2 of them snagged like a burr. Any fear of needles, and any fear of the color yellow. They were odd, and for a half-second they tasted like a joke. Still, I ticked no and no because I needed work more than I needed answers. Barney, the man who would eventually sit across from me behind a cramped office desk, had a handshake like a vice and a smile that looked like it had been carved out of habit. He set an old sewing machine on the table, pulled a spool of bright yellow thread from a drawer, and asked me to stitch a square into a swatch, 3 inches from the center, neat, precise. The machine hummed like a contented animal. My fingers moved the way they'd been trained by Grandma's slow, indifferent guidance, her hands steady over mine, years of patching and fixing folded into the muscle memory of my fingertips. Halfway through, something snagged my skin. The needle had threaded the pad of my finger, a fine, surprise prickle, then the sting of iron. Scarlet beaded on the white cloth. Barney laughed in that slow, country way. "She gets you sometimes," he said. "Don't see many folks who don't faint at the sight." I forced a grin, licked my finger, wiped the blood away. Stupid, I told myself. I need this job. A week later they called me in. "We'll get you on the schedule," Maurice said, bright as ever. Barney was impressed. Relief washed through me like warm water. The mill was steady. The money was steady. For a while, life settled into that comforting rhythm. I sewed boat covers during the day, fixed bellows and straps, and learned to tune a machine that hadn't seen an official mechanic in decades. The older women who worked there were quiet, their conversations a soft undercurrent. I liked the work. I liked the way the machine thrummed under my palms, like a living thing that wanted to be useful. But in small towns, secrets gather like dust. They stick to the underside of things. At a bonfire one night, someone mentioned a story about the stitcher, an old myth about a Depression-era tailor who stitched garments from the skinned remains of people who died in the winter starvation. My friends laughed and nudged each other like boys sharing a ghost story, but there was a tremor to the firelight that made my stomach knuckle. Drew, my friend who'd sent me the job, was obsessed with those half-truths and old maps and basements. He died months later from an overdose. The funeral was worse than any story. A boy laid out in a suit too neat for the dote he would soon kiss. The joke about needles curdled into something raw inside me. I didn't go near needles after that. Not for a while. The thought of them was a cold thing under my skin. Months passed. November came, and with it a drop in the air that felt like a silver blade. The mill's yellow paint gleamed like a smile that never faded, and the town behind it wore its abandonment like a hat. Barney, fierce about liability and building codes, would curse the elevator when it dinged at odd hours. "Draw on the system," he'd grumble. Maurice would wave it away with a chant about repairs scheduled and never arriving. Nobody wanted to talk about the basement. "Just stay clear," Barney told me once, his voice a low thing that carried more than caution. "Down there's a sump, water stagnant for a decade. A man could drown if they fell through. City codes say they can't fill it in. It's trouble. Trouble smells like oil and iron. Trouble gleams in the little details you choose to ignore. Trouble is what you get when you sneak down into places man told you to leave alone. The night I finally snuck into the basement started like any other. Staying late, finishing a last boat cover, the old lady's needles ticking like a chorus behind me. Barney handed me a mop and a key with a casual, "Lock up if you stay." I waited until the last light died and the building breathed in the hush. Then I slipped into the stairwell and forced the elevator out. It was stuck between floors, the metal facing dull and stubborn. I wedged a broom handle into the seam until the door sighed and gave enough for me to squeeze through. The elevator inside was bare, caged metal, a grated floor, and a faint yellow caution light that blinked like an insect heartbeat beneath the grate. A panel creaked as I dropped through the gap. My knees hit cold concrete. The smell of rust was a living thing, sharp and metallic, like a mouth. A hallway stretched away from the shaft, lit by a slow, rotating caution lamp that carved the metal walls into bands of light and shadow. I heard footsteps, maybe mine, maybe not. At the end, a figure opened a small metal door and slipped through. I called out. Nothing. The passage sloped down, and the ceiling sank until I had to crouch. The door at the far end had a cylinder with a T handle, an old sluice or safety catch. I thought. Curiosity makes coward take stupid chances. I stuck my arm into the cylinder to fumble with the handle. It was smooth and warm under my skin, not rusted at all. My fingers brushed a notch, and I cranked. The door thunked. The world reminded me how small I am. 12 needles exploded outward from holes in the cylinder and pierced my forearm like a sting of porcupine quills. The cloth of my sleeve bloomed with a web of red. Pain detonated through me sharp and immediate, so raw I swore and clawed at the metal. The needles stayed, fine and immovable, half an inch of steel biting into muscle. The yellow light above shifted an angry, fatal scarlet. You learn things about yourself in the span of a panic. How quickly your mind catalogs options, how the animal inside you calculates whether amputation is an option for survival. I could picture a rabbit gnawing its own limb off to escape a snare, and felt like the joke had been turned on me. I wrestled the handle back. The door slammed. The needles retracted as if I had never been impaled at all, leaving my arm a roadmap of pinpricks. Breath came back into me in shallow, hoarse gasps. My knees shook. I clambered back up into the elevator, hauled myself through the grate until sunlight stabbed my eyes and I spilled out of the shaft like a man climbing out of a grave. Noon had hardly passed. The sky was only just itself again. I drove to urgent care with the steering wheel slick under my fingers and my shirt stained like a flag of shame. The receptionist looked up from a book slowly, like she'd read my entry in the script of her day. The doctor cleaned and wrapped my arm, asked a few casual questions about how I'd hurt myself. He made a joke about the mill and the urine sample that was never sent, small-town levity that felt like dismissal. Any fear of needles? He asked, balancing a sterile vial in his gloved hand. He returned it to the cabinet with a casual flick. You don't seem like the type. I nodded, but the memory of steel in my arm was tender in the dark. The farm roads home droned past like a lullaby for someone who's been crying too long. I told Barney I'd take a day off. He grumbled and hung up but didn't push. He's a man who likes his systems to behave. That night, safe in my bed under Grandma's quilt, the huge, white tapestry she'd stitched for me when I was 6, I thought maybe the worst had passed. The quilt smelled of lavender and thyme. When I rolled over, my fingers brushed a square of stitching that hadn't been there before, a neat border of yellow thread, a tiny box sewn into the fabric where no box had existed before. My stomach dropped. The yellow was the exact shade of the mill. The needle pricks on my arm throbbed like a metronome. I stared at that tiny yellow square until the room began to tilt. The laugh of cicadas turned into a distant, irritating tick, like a machine counting down. You learn a second thing about yourself in moments like that, how quickly the ordinary can become monstrous. A spool of thread becomes someone else's design. A door with a T-handle becomes a mouth. A friendly yellow mill becomes a place with appetite. I still go to work. The money is good. The old ladies smile a little when I walk in. Barney nods at me with a new respect. But at night I fold the quilt over twice, check the locks, and dread the small, precise weight of a needle. If someone asks me whether the stitcher was real or a ghost story, I tell them this. Stories start as warnings. Sometimes they are literal. Sometimes they are metaphor. Sometimes they are a door left ajar in the basement of a yellow building, and if you reach inside you might find something that stitches you into its pattern. Some jobs change you. Some buildings stitch parts of you into their walls. For me, bees in the basket taught me to fear three small things: the sound of a sewing machine at night, the color yellow on a cold morning, and the way a single line of thread can make everything else fall into place.